that you cannot have sexual emancipation without addressing class structures.
Hello, everyone. We are going to be having a very sexy episode for you. You can see my sex purple, cyberpunk, cybernetic, futuristic stash ready to suck up all the juices. Sorry. It's a juicy stash. Hope you are appreciating my juicy, wonderful cyberpunk cybernetic outfit. Purple is my favorite color, and it is in homage to the topic that we are going to be talking about today, which is the juicy subject of the neoliberal colonization of our sexual and loving relationships with one another. The Bluebeard archetype is the man that you really wanted to marry, but he gives you a special key and he says, never open the closet. Of course, one day, Bluebeard, he goes on a vacation, and being a curious woman that you are, you open up the Pandora's box, which is his past, and you open up that closet, that room that you weren't supposed to open, and what do you find? You find hundreds, if not thousands, of dead bodies, dead wives, dead ex-relationships. And that is basically what cannot be talked about today in our virtue-signaling moral capitalist world. We are unable to talk about that closet. And today we are going to be opening up that closet for you guys, because I am the Bluebeard and I will be explaining the reasoning behind the existence of that closet. So if you haven't looked up the Bluebeard archetype, I like purple better. I've shaved my beard just for a mustache. So I'm just starting off with a contradiction. The contradiction here being the contradiction of the sexy, mysterious sunglasses and the wavy skirt, and that contradiction in comparison to the raw, brutal, and very unsexy naked body, and how a skirt and sunglasses are much sexier than the naked body, meaning that it's much sexier to be almost naked because we see reality through the dream, and that is why these paraphernalia become very important. Culture and fashion become really important when it comes to our relationship to sexiness and sex. So, on the one hand, we can see that reality can only be grasped at through the dream, as we've talked about on this channel and as we talk about in our analysis of ideology, that there is no red pill or blue pill. What we need for true emancipation is a third pill. But if we get rid of the dream completely, all we are left is with nightmare. Now, the irony here is that sexual liberation and the idea of the personal being political are almost at odds with each other. Why? Well, because sexual liberation, everybody has a different relationship, a almost personal relationship with what is and what could be your understanding of sexual liberation. Maybe an asexual person, a sexual liberation act might mean to not even engage in sex or not be bombarded by sexual images in everyday life like we are in our capitalist, sexy capitalist society. For another person, this might mean a different thing. So we all have a different relationship. We all have a very unique relationship with one another, and we all have a unique relationship to the idea of sexuality. Unfortunately, the idea of the personal being political, in fact, what it has done is there is an invasion of the political into the personal sphere, so that we all have to do a lot of these calculations in our head before we can be able to actually fall in love or engage in sexual acts with other people.
On the set of a porn film, an actor lost his erection mid-scene. To get it back, the erection, he turns away from the woman, naked. Below him, he grabs his phone and desperately searches for Pornhub. And if Weisman writes, this struck me as vaguely apocalyptic. Why? Weisman's comment, something is rotten in the state of sex.
There is a big brother, a third other, that is participating in our sexual lives. So one quick contradiction that we can see from this is a conflict between the ideas of deplatforming and the ideas between not shaming certain types of kinks. So kink shaming and deplatforming become contradictory ideals, and they both cannot be held in the same sentence. And however, because we are not allowed to critique, we can see that these contradictions are upheld. So now we live in a world where if you believe in a gender binary and you say that in your lecture, you should be expecting to be deplatformed, but at the same time, you can totally make the most outrageous forms of violent pornography, and you can totally expect to be protected by the mantra of anti-kink shaming. So no free speech, but totally allowed to do whatever you want with regards to sexuality. So in one way, we do need to be conscious of the other intersectional perspectives that may shape our sexuality and how pornography may change what our relationship is to sex, and how cultural ideas of beauty or race, class, gender, sex, all of these ideas might come into play with our question of who we decide to have sex with, who we decide to engage in relationships with, and all of that. But this actually has the opposite of its intended effect, which is when you are hyper aware about someone's privilege and about their privileged relationship to sex, then you become, in a way, narcissistically reinforcing those privileged attitudes towards sex. And especially in a world where we, for example, we say to women that they should never settle. You should never settle. And as a result, who ends up being the most sexy people in our society are the people with the most privilege with their sexuality. They chose you. With all that privilege in the world, they could have chosen anybody in the world, but they chose you for a one-night stand, and you should feel fulfilled for that. And unfortunately, people like me have to, and a lot of males are actually paying the emotional labor cost of this collective decision to uphold the privileged people in our society. And, that's why I'm not speaking from my ass. I am actually speaking from much experience, and I'm actually trying to articulate a women's perspective from within the throng of agreeableness and hive mind mentality of womeninity, of femininity, that actually what it does is silence a other aspect of femininity. And that's why you need an ex-male feminist like me to speak up against the horde of people just repeating the same neoliberal idioms in our destitute last stand of a society, this dystopic world known as cyberpunk. Cybernetic robots are gonna replace us all. Okay, so although the best way or the closest way of getting at the real is to analyze the reality through the dream, once we get rid of the dream, all we are left with is nightmare. On the other hand, the closest, once you get at the real, you get at the really good sex as well. And what is that really good sex? that really good sex is free, completely, almost free from the surplus fantasies that we have to have in order to see and be in love and be in the moment when having sex with another person. How many times have you had sex with somebody and you are thinking of somebody else, or you're thinking of pornography, or you're thinking of something sexy, or you're thinking of a transgression, or you're thinking of a taboo, or you're thinking of a kink, or something surplus that is invading, some other thing that is invading your relationship to the other person. You see, the best sex possible is the one where there is no phantasmic surplus. It's like going to an optometrist and the person has these lenses, the optometrist has these lenses, and the lenses correspond to what is reality. And not only with your reality, but the other person's lenses are also corresponding. And you can see that void. You can look into that void of somebody's eyes, and that, my friends, that is the utmost. But today, because of a specific neoliberal culture, a neoliberal sex act where sex is not really about the sex, sex is about power rather than love. All the world is about sex, and sex, my friends, it's about power, unfortunately. Well, in that world where we do cost-benefit analysis with regards to every aspect of our lives, where we treat other people as a means to an end, in that world, my friends, sex becomes, well, something lame, something not for sex itself. It's sex for something else. And we're going to be analyzing that.
Let's say you live a happy life. You are lucky, you have a job, you meet regularly with friends, you are not in love, you just make one-night stands, maybe here and there, you meet every evening with friends, you drink, you go to blah, blah. Then all of a sudden, in a totally contingent way, let's say you stumble on the street, somebody helps you to stand up, it's a young girl or boy, blah, blah, and of course, it's the love of your life. A totally contingent encounter, but the result can be that your whole life changes. Nothing is the same, as they say. You even spontaneously perceive your entire past life as leading towards this unique moment. You know, the illusion of love is, oh my God, I was waiting all my life for you. Something like this would have been the love event. And I think it's getting more and more rare today. Many intelligent cultural critics noticed how we are almost returning to pre-romantic, pre-modern times when marriage or love connections were a matter of relatives, counselors, and so on. Your uncle, your aunt, they selected whom you will marry, and so on. Today, it's similar, only instead of all those old wise uncles and so on, it's dating agencies, marriage agencies, and so on and so on. What they offer us is precisely love without the fall, without falling in love, without this totally unpredictable traumatic encounter. And that's what I find very sad.
It's a product of our unhealthiness. And what's even worse is that psychology, as we can see, a lot of psychological idioms, neoliberal psychological idioms, reinforce these ideologies. So a little review before we continue. The concrete neoliberal form and content of psychology are our self, our emotion of love, our sexuality, our attention and perception, our memory, our child development, our femininity and masculinity, our parenting, our eating, our dressing, thinking, reasoning, needs, and our communicating. Neoliberal psychology is as much as our character as being French or Italian is. Italians don't simply live in Italy. They are Italian, and their psyches and bodies are Italian in the sense that they have Italian form and content. They act and think and dress and eat Italian. Neoliberal psychology is our cultural psychology, just as Italian is cultural psychology. We are neoliberal subjects, just as we are Italian or French. Our psychology has neoliberal form and content, just as we emphasize the unique, concrete, incomparable, untranslatable qualities of Ifiluk emotions, Japanese ame, Yoruba mental illness, Wahhabi Islamic femininity, Victorian sexuality, Kibbutsian self-concept. So we must emphasize the concrete, incomparable, untranslatable form and content of the neoliberal self, emotions, perceptions, femininity, childhood, motives, needs, and neoliberal sexuality. Because neoliberal psychology reflects and embodies neoliberal cultural factors, it can be an important window into expanding our understanding of neoliberalism. Neoliberal psychology gives life to official structural policies. It informs us of the manner in which they are lived by people and the effects they have on real life. Neoliberal psychology testifies to the level of development of neoliberalism in political and economic domains. The more pervasive that neoliberal love, sexuality, self-conception, childhood, parenthood, needs, and interpersonal relations are, the more dominant neoliberal political economy is, because psychology reflects such macro psychological factors. It is remarkable that virtually all psychologists ignore the dominant character of human psychology in the world today, the dominant character being neoliberalism. The intensification and extension of capitalism produce qualitative changes in capitalist social life. They modify the class structure, social policies, social leaderships, rights and obligations, opportunities and restrictions, the form and content of education, entertainment, recreation, work, news, information, childhood, eating, self-conception, and sexuality. These social changes directly affect the concrete form and content of neoliberal psychology. So it's almost all-encompassing, and in a way, just as we have to see the reality through the dream, first we must recognize the blue pills that we have been eating, and that blue pill is basically the same as the red pill, and in a way, they're both neoliberal psychology. The blue pill and the red pill, there's nothing different to them. You're just choosing one matrix over another, but both of them are basically neoliberal psychology. We need a third pill. And the best example of this is how both the left-wing intersectional psychology today is upholding the idea of virtue signaling. There is a virtue in virtue signaling. You are role modeling. And then the evolutionary psychology right wing also says the same. They agree on this very point, which is that it's an evolutionary thing and we all have been virtue signaling. It's a form of moral grandstanding. So you can look at that yourself, and then you can see that there is no difference between red and blue or whatever. That's why I love the color purple. Culturally organized tools organize psychological operations by stipulating requirements, motives, procedures, and objectives, rewards, and punishments for behavior. So this neoliberal psychology is also enforced through deplatforming and the other side of that coin, which is the platforming of straw man instead, and through the Duluth model, which enforces a neoliberal psychology, through various psychological organizations that are allied to court systems, through the judicial system, through carceral feminism that enforces neoliberal psychology. And we can see at the end, we'll see how toxic masculinity, regulation of what is so-called toxic masculinity, is also endemic to this. And that's why all feminism in terms of the political being personal is carceral feminism, because it invites the carcerality, this biopolitical carcerality, into our interpersonal relationships, into our private relationships with one another, and all of the unique relationships that we can have with one another are instead turned into generalizable political situations, which basically destroys the whole concept of love being a unique relationship between two people, a relationship that nobody else can fulfill, a uniqueness that you cannot replace. People has been replaced by a culture of replaceability. You are just like how Marshall McLuhan talks about replaceability and interchangeability as the mechanical functions of capitalism, of pre-capitalism or modernity, the same way we do to one another. What's that song? To the left. A lot of these songs are also reproducing this thing. And, I could play hundreds of songs today that reinforce this neoliberal culture and neoliberal psychology. Binkley, 2012, exposes ways in which psychological theories and interventions neutralize structural issues such as class structure and the conflict between capital and labor. In the US, in the early decades of the 20th century, a convergence of new plans and strategies of the regulation of intimacy drew together the efforts of progressive social workers, charities, social psychologists, sexologists, eugenic scientists, and activists. The eugenic scientists here really being an interesting one. Their various efforts shaped the nascent fields of marriage counseling, family therapy, and sex therapy. Broadly speaking, these efforts combine the social objectives of the welfare state centering on the enforcement of social cohesion, the reduction of conflict between labor and capital, and mobilization of labor power itself with the biopolitical objectives of a professional, medico-institutional complex. Through psychoanalysis, intimacy could be conceived as a space of rich intersubjectivity structured by deep psychological agencies embedded in repressed memories of early childhood experience, accessible through dreams, free association, and the like. You see how Jungian psychology is also really complicit in this. Binkley goes on to describe the specifically neoliberal characteristics of the human potential movements of the 60s and 70s and contemporary life coaching therapeutics. And we can see a parallel here with Catherine Liu's conversation regarding Oprah. The humanistic psychologies of the 60s and 70s rejected structural models of psychological disturbance as rooted in family dynamics, where the implicit functionalism of the family system's perspective seemed to diminish the sovereignty of the individual. A humanistic view of the family described the affirmative potentials for growth and self-realization within a family environment in which subjective uniqueness was maximized and celebrated. That is a beautiful statement. It's so unfortunate that the family structure has been seen as allied to capitalism, as a patriarchal alliance to capitalism, when it's just a kinship structure. First, capitalism destroyed the far-off relationships with our family, and now it's destroying the family structure itself. The individual was exalted above social structures. Carl Rogers, like Maslow, theorized self-actualization in the figure of the fully functional individual who lived fully and richly in the present. Increasingly, it was up to the subject of intimacy herself to undertake the work of her own daily life. The belief of these feelings existed that they were, if properly actualized, benevolent, affirming of self and other, and that they were pulsating just beneath the surface of the formalized masks shaped by our social rules, empowered the individual as potential entrepreneur of her own emotional life. In 1951, Rogers' client-centered therapy, for example, proposed a recognition of the clinical dyad of analyst and client under the motif of client empowerment, a shift that would open new space for clients to develop and exercise their own motivational resources and potentials, with the role of the analyst shifted from director to facilitator. This is individualistic, entrepreneurial, neoliberal ideology, plain and simple, adopted by and reproduced by professional psychologists. From a neoliberal standpoint, intimacy, like all other areas of society and personal life, must be disembedded from the technologies of dependencies and welfare provision, from the dependencies it incurs, and reinvent as a new medium of autonomy and self-interest. For this purpose, any surviving vestiges of welfarism reflected in the hierarchical diffusion of expert knowledge, the designation of pathology through normative judgments, or the institutionalization of treatment in any form must be reduced and transformed. You can see that this directly has affected my sexuality, because my sexuality is based on giving, and I love to give, and I love to give, I love to receive, I love to give in order for them to give. But giving, when everybody gives in a sexual and a normal and a loving relationship, when everybody is giving to the relationship, it's the closest thing to self-perpetuating energy. When everybody is giving without doing a social calculation, without doing an amygdalic social calculation, the sex is better, the love is better, the relationship is better, and it becomes a form of self-perpetuating energy. That is the closest thing to self-perpetuating energy. It's right there in front of us. When we all give and give and give, we do end up receiving, and we don't have to do that calculation. But now our relationships, and I've noticed this, and this is why I'm even motivated to make these videos, is because there's so much cultural, political in our relationships, in my dating culture these days, that there is no unique relationship with, especially people who are agreeable, incredibly agreeable, and people who cannot develop their own individuality and be secure enough to have that individual relationship with another person. Instead, everything becomes a manifestation of the political. Everything becomes an amygdalic cost-benefit analysis, and that's, no, I don't blame any specific person because we do live in an insecure world. The funny thing is that the state, this neoliberal state, is coming to save you from the insecurities, and it actually doesn't do that. What it does is actually give you, through biopolitics, it gives you bare life, bare existence, rather than full life. And that was one of my points against Silvia Federici. Silvia Federici said that communal existence was a way of survival. No, it's not. Communal existence is not a way of survival. Capitalism is a way of survival. Neoliberalism is a way of survival. Carceral feminism is a way of survival. It's the bare life. It gives you bare life. You're trading in full freedom, full expression, full ability to speak, for the ability to have security, for the ability to feel safe. And this need to feel safe, you go out and you try to find people of privilege to defend you. And in fact, there are psychological studies, because we live in a rape culture. Of course, we live in a rape culture. That's what the feminists say. I don't deny this, but the vicarious traumatization of this rape culture, which increases the panic among women, actually what happens is, when people are traumatized or vicariously traumatized, they look to traditional signs of masculinity to defend them. Isn't that ironic? Okay. And there are psychological studies about that. Such heavy institutional forms of the government of intimacy foster institutional compliance and docility, and suppress the will to self-differentiation within the actor. Moreover, from the standpoint of the subject of intimate governance, one's co-intimate must not be allowed to impose the burden of normative emotional reciprocity through an appeal to either psychological depth or an implicit psychological life force strategies that extend normative integrationist mandate of welfarism. So what's even worse is that if I'm in a relationship like that, when I ask for someone to really think critically about all of these neoliberal forms of subjectivity that are enforced upon us, that is seen as a form of unhealthiness. When I ask for, my partner to have loving sex, for example, that is seen as a trauma, which is so inverted, which is so fucked up, which is really messed up in our society, when a lot of feminists are saying that your need you want as a man to have loving sex is based off of trauma? No, it's not. I've dealt with my trauma, okay? You calling it that is really interesting. And it's not just one person. It's a lot of hive mind mentality that tries to forcefully separate love from sex, as if because there's a group of 1% men that go around banging everybody, because they get to enforce that culture onto everyone, what happens is men like me have to pay for the emotional labor of that 1% of men. It's women don't have to pay for that emotional labor, and they don't have to recognize it, because we live in a power equals privilege society that destroys our ability to have real human connections with other people, and we replace all that with a amygdalic inspired cost-benefit analysis. So, the intimate subject of neoliberalism would be one who views himself as entrepreneur of his own intimate life and holds his own capacity for emotional investments as a form of human capital, valued for the potential returns of happiness it might provide. So if you're interested in that, I have this book right here, The Foundations of Social Capital, with Elinor Ostrom, and we are going to be doing a whole history of where these cancerous ideas first started, and we're going to be doing a whole analysis on the concept of social capital, and it's going to be really, really juicy. So that's going to be another project that we are going to be talking about. I really want to be talking about aliens, but I have to stick to this human stuff. Self-help authors and life coaches deepen the neoliberal character of contemporary psychotherapeutics. In their effort to radically disembed the individual from social structures and cultivate an individualistic agency, these advisors eschew all psychological theory about complex psychological dynamics in social interactions. For these theories encumber the individual to work through alien psychological processes according to their own dynamics. This impedes radical individualistic agency to make one's own life as one wishes, akin to making one's enterprise as one wishes. Neoliberal psychotherapeutics dispenses with binding psychological systems as they dispense with social systems. Of course, you're not actually free. You are determined even more by the market. That's what's really scary here. You're not actually free. You're free in the same sense that you go to a grocery store and everything is made of sugar and palm oil, and you can choose between all the different ideas that are made from exploited surplus labor and extraction of capital, but nothing there is actually of substance. Just like how even if you are trying to be healthy and you go and you try to find some protein shake, what you're paying for is like 50% rice, and everything has a surplus labor and surplus extraction included within the price. And even worse, there's an ideological surplus as well, where you buy your Starbucks coffee and the death of the rainforest is paid for by the coffee itself. As it destroys the rainforest, it replants trees, so don't worry. And we all know that the problem is that you can never replace the diversity of the Amazon with a regulated human process, unless there is a solar punk future where we can recreate rainforests. The field of life coaching is one that remains largely free from conventional licensing requirements. You know how many of my friends have become life coaches? Oh my goodness. This status stems from the field's deeply rooted opposition to the tradition of psychotherapy and counseling, which labor under the field's advocates contend all the medicalizing, pathologizing, backwards-looking, and negative views that have dodged the psychological enterprise from the beginning. An article comparing coaching with therapy marks these differences. Therapy assumes that the client needs healing. In fact, one of the ways that I actually, quote, healed was my insistence and my realization that there are just some things that just cannot be healed. And for me to truly be healed in a way, I have to learn with living with those wounds on my wrist, to live with my heart outside. And that's what it means to truly be healed. To truly be healed, in a way, means to recognize that there are just some things within our collective trauma, within our own trauma, that can just never be healed. And you kind of make peace with that. Whereas this idea of continually trying to, with your amygdala, trying to categorize the concept of love like bell hooks does, or keep exploring, keep finding ways towards healing, that in itself, you are replacing the cure for the poison. It's a pharmacon. That motivation in itself, this motivation to understand, to bring everything into Verstand, to understand everything, to put everything under you, that need to do that Verstand is a form of unhealing. It's a form of never actually coming to the point where you can just heal. And the problem is that we can't sometimes, unless you're a very strong character, we can't do that individually. We are created and we are formed and we are enforced by our cultural psychology, our cultural ways of being, and our cultural idiomatics. So we can't actually have that individuation process completely. The individuation process itself is part of a collective structure. It's another form of this seeing the reality through the dream aspect. Once you see the reality through the dream, once you're able to do that, once you are able to align the lenses of your life with the life of other people, or especially with an intimate partner, can also see that lens as well. Hopefully, that is the most peaceful way of living. This culture of too many gurus is part and parcel to the capitalist culture of our postmodern tradition, which is why I focus so heavily in my Ritual Traces series on the idea of collective rights. By referring to Habermas's compelling illustration regarding the ancientness of recognizing the unexplainable void of existence in a section of his work entitled A Hypothesis Considering the Evolutionary Meaning of Rights. Here, Habermas describes how, though most primates have the ability to refer to objects in the world, the ability to maintain a shared symbolic reference to an unexplainable void with regard to the question of existence itself is perhaps a symbolic reference particular to humans. Similarly, Confucius also talked in terms of restoring an ancient harmony, but the practical import of his teaching was to lead men to look for new ways of interpreting and refashioning a local tradition in order to bring into being a new universal order to replace the contemporary disorder. Through a violent break to reveal clearly the nexus of the individual to society, an individual undergoes a ceremonial rite of passage to leave their intersubjective social world and gain their own particular entry into the universal, the universally shared symbolic reference to the crisis of meaning which the whole of society itself has been thrown into. Meaning, or at least the ability to allude to even the most minimal sensibilities, must come under crisis for a protagonist to arrive at a crossroads where a decision needs to be made. After having strived so hard to turn around, escape the cave, and discover the sun, a decision needs to be made about whether to return to the cave, to the society. Only when the protagonist of a ceremonial rite of passage recognizes a shared corporeal vulnerability, that the body will die with the rest of their tribe, are they then confronted with this question of how they should proceed, or what kind of life they should live. Confucius extends this individualistic theme of crisis, like the moment of doubt on the cross, by alluding to how social crisis is an essential ground of a civilized political social unity as well. This critical juncture, coinciding with the Confucian emphasis on processes rather than turning points, is that both the individual and society are never actually in a position to choose.
That is, both the individual and collective protagonists are always only ever operating from inside the cave. Therapy assumes that clients need healing, works with people to achieve self-understanding and emotional healing, explores the root of problems, so-called root, focuses on feelings and past events, works for internal resolution of pain to let go of old patterns. By contrast, coaching is forward-looking, concentrating not on the past pains and their internal residues, but on potentials for future aspirations. Coaching assumes the client is whole, focuses on actions in the future, works with the conscious mind, works for external solutions to overcome barriers, learn new skills, and implement effective choices. The field of positive psychology similarly seeks to redress the pathologizing focus of traditional psychologies through the empowerment of the individual as the mediator and entrepreneur of her own psychological life. So, positive psychologists provide advice on how to promote positive thoughts and optimistic assessments of self-situation, which are assumed to facilitate positive outcomes of our actions. Through thought interventions, one learns to switch off negative thought patterns. Through planned disruptions of one's routines, one learns to interrupt the downward spiral to negative emotional states. While Binkley reveals the neoliberal features of psychotherapeutics, he fails to comprehend that these features are ideological. They divert attentions from political economic reality, the class structure and practices of neoliberal capitalism, and its social relations that distress people and need to be reorganized. They promote the entrepreneurial ideology of individual autonomy, which blinds individuals to increasingly autocratic constructions and coercions of capitalist macrocultural factors. This blinding leaves individuals more subjugated to constricting, coercive social reality because they cannot see it. Psychotherapeutics, like all social psychology, is complicit in social oppression, not emancipation. This is why psychotherapeutics is acceptable. Binkley does not recognize this or critique it. He speaks out about entrepreneurial therapeutic coaching as a viable practice for achieving freedom, self-actualization, and self-expression. He is therefore an ideologue, not a critic. And it's funny here, right? Because Binkley uses the word biopolitical.
What we need is the biopolitical. Biopolitics, I think, if I understand Foucault correctly, has never been about an equal and fair distribution of resources and possibilities. It's rather about the, let's say, economically reasonable management of what is available, right? In terms also of illnesses, epidemics, but it's also about the monitoring, the control, and it doesn't mean that the horizon of biopolitics, it would be really naive, I think, to think that its horizon is an equal distribution of resources.
Assuming that he understands the full implications of that word, but then goes on to give biopolitical considerations, neoliberal biopolitical solutions. And this is part and parcel to a culture where every lecture that you go to, the lecturer has to end on a good note. Neoliberal ideology has thus formed a powerful psychological tool or technique of subjectification or mentalite or schema, which has shaped the psyche or habitus of these professors. Ideology supersedes or covers the social reality that causes indebtedness. Ideology is so powerful that it even distorts the perception and conception of young professors who have themselves incurred student debt in the neoliberal era. These professors have allowed ideology to frame their own personal experience, which includes their memory as well as the interpretation of their colleagues' experiences. And now we get to the truly sexy stuff. Neoliberalism is a sexually transmitted disease, hookup sex. A prominent neoliberal form of sexuality is hookup sex. It is common on university campuses, but also beyond. I present detailed descriptions of hookup sex based on students' own reports. Then I shall elucidate neoliberal cultural themes that can be discerned with these sexual descriptions. My point in presenting examples is to understand the neoliberal quality of certain psychological functions, not to determine its prevalence in the population. It is interesting to know that a survey which included 2,400 students and spanned 21 universities reported 20% of women and a quarter of men had hooked up with 10 or more people. Less than 1/3 of college students graduate without hooking up once. At 11 on a weeknight earlier this year, her work finished. A slim, pretty junior at the University of Pennsylvania did what she often does when she has little free time. She texted her regular hookup, the guy she's been sleeping with but not dating. What was he up to? He texted back, come over, so she did. They watched a little TV, had sex, and went to sleep. Their relationship, she noted, is not about the meeting of two souls. We don't really like each other in person, sober, she said, adding that we literally can't sit down and have a coffee. Asked her why she was in such a relationship at Penn, she won't complain about the death of a courtship or men who won't commit. Instead, she'll talk about cost-benefit analyses and low investment costs of hooking up. I position myself in a college in a way that I can't have a meaningful romantic relationship because I'm always busy and the people that I am interested in are always busy too. It's too much emotional labor to put in to a relationship itself, just like it's too much emotional labor to do any form of collective action. Taylor explains the elite universities are filled with driven young women, many of whom aspire to be doctors, lawyers, politicians, bankers, or corporate executives in the competition. In the competitive job environment with unsure job prospects and a shaky economy, many of them approach college as a race to acquire credentials, top grades, leadership positions in student organizations, sought-after internships. Their time out of class is filled with club meetings, sport practices, and community service projects. These women said they saw building their resumes, not finding boyfriends, never mind husbands, as their main job. They envisioned their 20s as a period of unencumbered striving, when they might work at a bank in Hong Kong one year, then go to business school and move to a corporate job in New York. The idea of lugging a relationship through all these transitions was hard for many to imagine. In this context, some women seized the opportunity to have sex without relationships, preferring hookup buddies, regular sex partners with little emotional commitment, investment to boyfriends. For them, college is an endless series of competitions, student clubs. Some demands multiple rounds of interviews to be selected for special research projects and the choicest internships, and in the end to land the most elite job offers. We are very aware of cost-benefit issues and trading up and trading down, so no one wants to be too tied to someone, may not be the person that they want to be in a couple months. One girl said. Instead, she enjoyed casual sex on her terms, often late at night after a few drinks. I definitely wouldn't say I've regretted any one of my one-night stands. I'm a true feminist, she adds. I'm a strong, independent woman. I know what I want. Neoliberal cultural themes are evident in this sensitive account. These interviews reveal how students' sexual relations are structured by socioeconomic pressures and neoliberal values. They are not simply casual sex for pleasure. They rather reflect concrete capitalist pressures and values, although they are a minority of college women at this point in time. Verbal accounts of sexual experience reflect the characteristics of neoliberal cultural factors without usually explicitly naming these factors, although they sometimes do. Indeed, the subjects are not aware of the specific macrocultural factors that generate and organize and sustain their psychological behavior. Here I'm reminded by a quote by René Girard's analysis of how Shakespeare satirizes a society of would-be individualists completely enslaved to one another. So you think you're free, but you're really just operating within a cultural milieu, and you're just doing what everyone else is doing, and there's no freedom in that. You're choosing between different cereals. Indeed, the subjects are not usually aware of their specific cultural factors, macrocultural factors that generate and organize and sustain their psychology or behavior. Their psychology/behavior is analogous to the shadows in Plato's cave allegory, whose origins outside of the cave are not comprehended. The cultural origins and character are better comprehended by external observers, cultural psychologists, who have cultural names of them. Dilthey calls this Beserwestenheim, or better understanding than the subject has of the phenomenological experience. You can only challenge your universality, your ideological universality, from outside. That's the whole problem with all of this identity politics too, is that they don't allow for critique from the outside, whether it's feminism or CRT or Duluth model. All of these power equals privilege ideals cannot be criticized from outside, and that in a way reinforces itself, and it's the perfect gift to the neoliberal state. This is akin to a doctor who peruses a patient's verbal descriptions of symptoms and then employs his expertise to identify their causes, prognosis, and treatment for discussion of cultural phenomenological methodology or cultural hermeneutics, in Dilthey's words, that elucidates cultural themes in psychological expressions. These women who engage in hookup sex explain their sexual choice as clear-sighted way of coping with neoliberal social pressures of success in school, obtaining a high status, demanding unstable job, and pressures to exercise, engage in extracurricular activities, and social life. Neoliberal pressures not only form the context of their lives, they also form the response to this context. Isn't that interesting? Their response takes the form of adjusting, contouring their sexual emotional relationships to be compatible with the neoliberal socioeconomic pressures, to enable the women to successfully cope with these pressures. Now, another thing that's really interesting is that a lot of these affirmative action programs, which bolster people who are agreeable to the already present system, that's really interesting. So affirmative action basically makes sure that the people who are agreeing to the culture of social capitalism get above, rather than people who are disagreeable. If you are disagreeable, which is toxic masculinity in this sense, which is the devil's advocate toxic masculinity, and it's funny because I've searched devil's advocate toxic masculinity, and it seems like it's a harder paper to find, but there were definitely dozens of articles about it a couple months ago. I don't know where they all went. Google is such a game player, right? Disagreeableness cannot be tolerated within the neoliberal system. Their response takes the form of adjusting, contouring their sexual and emotional relationships to be compatible with the neoliberal socioeconomic pressures. That is, to enable the women to successfully cope with these pressures. The cognitive decision-making process about how to cope takes the form of a business calculation. It weighs costs and benefits of personal involvements vis-a-vis socioeconomic requirements. The latter are judged to be more beneficial than personal entanglements, which are construed as a cost to socioeconomic success. Then, the outcome of this business calculation is to adjust the form and content of their sexual emotional activities to the form and content of neoliberal socioeconomic interactions. The women remain independent, self-directed, egocentric, unencumbered, nimble, available to quickly shift into tough competitive socioeconomic activities when they call. In other words, because socioeconomic activities are tough and competitive and impersonal and do not make allowances for personal entanglements, women have accommodated to this social form and adopted it for their personal sexual relationships. They become detached, impersonal, and focused upon obtaining that service, product they want in exchange for giving their partner a reciprocal product, service, namely sex. This abstract buyer-seller interaction that is mediated by services of equal value displaces concern for the human individual just as it does for the economic marketplace. The buyer and seller do not care about each other as people, only as suppliers or consumers of a service or product. And I'm reminded here by a progressive leftist article called "Why Don't Woke Boys Pay for Sex?" So we can see that this culture of paying for sex is actually seen as progressive. When a drug dealer is selling meth or crack to people on the street, these evil people who are doing that with their sensuousness, they are inviting people to buy this terrible product. we shame that person. But when it comes to the person who sells sex, they are shielded from shame from a culture of neoliberal psychology that sees itself as progressive and a savior for a certain type of person, rather than them also being a form of drug dealer. When it comes to shaming the CEOs, we have no problem with that. But when it comes to our own complicity with regards to shame, we deconstruct the concept of shame itself. These women have contoured their sexual personal relationships in strict accordance of the requirements of neoliberal capitalist success, and then frame it as freedom, and then frame it as progressive. Hookups are not simply casual free sex. The girls tell us that their sex is carefully contoured to meet the demands of neoliberal material and social success. Hookup sex, like all psychology, has a cultural objective and basis. These hookup women have adopted neoliberal ideals as their own ideals of success, freedom, and pleasure. They are satisfied with their cost-benefit approach to sex. Indeed, they pride themselves on them because they are a measurement of strength, decisiveness, autonomy, success, competitiveness in neoliberal terms, not to mention psychological health. Detached, alienated, impersonal, calculating, self-centered sexual relations are confabulated as feminist or emancipatory. These neoliberal women have given feminism to the neoliberal cause. And this, my friend, this is where I disagree with Karl Ratner. My friend, Karl, the personal is political started as a neoliberal project. It was always neoliberal. The closest thing to a non-neoliberal feminism was found in the work of Hannah Arendt, and Hannah Arendt was excommunicated. More details about hookup sex is provided in sociologist Wade's report of her students' experiences. They echo the previous idea that market relationships are liberating and should be applied to sexual relationships, where they displace traditional myths about romantic love. Now, this is another thing. Romantic love is seen as patriarchal. 28% of women believe that romantic love brainwashes women, tricking them into investing their time and energies in someone else. Another 19% think that it might. Almost half of female students then think that love might bring them something bad instead of something good. The thing is, even thinking of love in this terms of cost-benefit analysis is a failure. Love is a energy-sucking thing. Love itself is contrary to the rationalization of capitalism. Love requires you to die for the other person, to put your life on the line for the other person. That kind of extreme romantic love, that kind of Romeo and Juliet love, it requires you to put your life on the line for the other person. That love is contrary to a capitalist cost-benefit analysis. And this is basically my complaint about this idea that the Ukraine is being defended by the West as a form of military-industrial complex, because the military-industrial complex doesn't want to actually put itself into danger. It's democracy. It's the idea of democracy, this idea of sacrificing for something. It's these democratic ideals of democracy that require you to sacrifice and put your life on the line for something greater than yourself. That's something that the military-industrial complex won't do. The military-industrial complex will take on Afghanistan, but taking on Russia is more of a necessity, right? And I'm going to have some debates with tankies sooner or later. Right now, explained a female student at Princeton, I have to focus on my career, getting through medical school, establishing myself. Based on my own experience, wrote a Wesleyan University alumni, this new sexual paradigm has given women the freedom to focus on their own lives and careers. I know it sounds hyperbolic, but I mean it when I say that getting married right now would ruin my life. I want a chance to pick up and move to a new city for a new job or a new adventure without having to worry about a spouse or a family. I need to be able to stay at the office until 3 a.m. if I have to and not care about putting dinner on the table. Many of the female students feel the same. They argue that hooking up is a way to reject oppressive sexism, pursue sexual liberation, and challenge the idea that women are supposed to be passive. They're not alone. The hookup is the road to sexual emancipation. My friends and I are likely sexual vultures, bragging a woman at Syracuse. Hookups are described by women as sexual liberation itself. Romantic attachments are felt to be encumbrances upon market relations, which are the key to social, economic, and psychological success and fulfillment. Romance must be superseded by market social relations in personal sexual relations. This means impersonal, alienated, uncaring, egocentric, hedonistic, transient, personal sexual relationships, which is hookup sex. The problem here, as Ratner will point out, isn't really in the realm of sex at all. It's in the realm of culture, and how, because these women have a lot of social capital, they have a lot of power to shape the culture itself. They basically reinvigorate this social market, social capitalism, neoliberal culture. Just as how we shape our tools and our tools shape us, this neoliberal social shaping culture created by the power that women have in the social sphere, by all repeating the same psychological ideas, by all repeating the same things on the internet and beyond. This culture is in their hands, and they continually give all that power to the 1%. That's what's really crazy about this whole thing. If this was just in the realm of sex, I wouldn't give a shit. It's not all women that do this. It's the ones with the social capital, with the economic capital, the ones that reaffirm affirmative action that again fulfills this self-fulfilling prophecy through the back door, through what's called a progressive means that gives the power to the 1%. And that whole system is what is basically destroying the ability for socialism, for communism, for something that a society that we can all be proud of. And because academia, even the discipline of philosophy, which I am from, even those ivory towers have been taken over by this power equals privilege logic, it doesn't allow for critique from the outside to be able to see this obvious truth that is in front of us. And as a result, they also become complicit in the system by not allowing the basically, or not listening to what is the real subaltern perspective here. And the reason I know this is because I'm the guy who pays for the emotional labor out of all of this. If you're going to be talking about cost-benefit analysis, the unrecognized emotional labor of men like me, who are then have to pay for all of this, it's not fair to us. One of the worst creations out of all of this is men's liberation, or all these male feminists, the ideological world where I was created from. But I'm a thinker. I don't just repeat things. I was a feminist for a long time, but I realized that this whole recruitment of males as being male feminists is basically the worst form of gaslighting that exists within this neoliberal feminist intersectional psychology. Getting it on. The neoliberal mating call to neoliberal sex. Hookup sex is carefully prepared for. It is not suddenly and unexpectedly forced upon women. For instance, women prepare for hookups by dressing appropriately, verbally encouraging each other, and consuming alcohol and drugs in order to free themselves to participate. Yeah, I'm not sure I should call them women here. It's correct, actually, to call them girls. It's like the preliminary material for a theory of a young girl. These are girls, not women. These are girls. And actually, that distinction between women and girl is actually a feminist talking point. The goal is to look fuckable, Miranda says, her voice buzzing with excitement. She and her roommate Ruby were tearing through tiny closets, collecting a pile of provocative items to consider wearing to that night's party. The theme was burlesque, so they were going for a classy stripper vibe. Bridget offered 2 cents as she headed back to their room. Lacy bras, corsets, fishnet stockings, anything that hints at being sexy underwear. Ruby pulled on tights, short shorts, and calf-high boots. On top, she wore bright yellow bra and a see-through white tank top. Miranda plumped her breasts and contemplated her outfit. Blah, 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 blah. They tossed back their shots and headed out. Let's get some dick tonight, ladies, she yelled. They tossed back their shots and headed out. It was approaching midnight. Initiating hookup sex. Grinding at dance parties. After getting physically and mentally prepared for hookup sex, social interactions are cultivated to make it happen. Ensuring that they are seen dancing and potentially hooking up with just the right person, all while super drunk, takes careful planning, consideration, and decision making. It's all capitalist cost-benefit analysis. It is a delicate ballet, a calculated grind. Men hope to approach and be welcomed by the buttocks of women who are considered to be as hot or hotter than them. Women, in response, make their own judgment call, or let their friends make one from across the circle, and respond by grinding, with feeling, with indifference, or skittering away. If one or both partners seems uninterested, the dance may be short-lived. If both partners are into it, the physical contact can escalate quickly. A Stanford student observed that men are allowed to touch women in such ways that would otherwise be deemed inappropriate. It's a license to grope, one woman remarked. If things get especially hot and heavy, it's perfectly within the rules to reach underneath a woman's clothes and even into her body. Fingering occurs with some regularity at college dance parties. It's a common thing, observed one of my students, echoing several others. Accordingly, students in monogamous relationships don't generally grind, except with one another. It's considered cheating. At one party, all around me, she wrote, I saw female friends of mine meeting guys and flirting and dancing and making out. She would join the dance floor shortly and, in the midst of throbbing crowd, end up dancing with Levy. They danced for a while, she turned around, and eventually Levy carried her piggyback the 2 blocks to his dorm. They fell onto his bed laughing, and suddenly it was happening. Again, we see girls actively, deliberately, voluntarily, excitedly planning and initiating hookup sex. This includes a specific social psychology about selecting acceptable partners. It must be as crude as the preparations of the act in order to consummate the crude character of the hookup itself. Social psychology of selecting acceptable partners for hookup sex. What maintains privilege. About a guy she actually quite disliked, one of the female students said plainly, I want to hook up with him for social status. Hooking up with students who are widely considered hot was a way to get some of their status to rub off on you. In our room, one of my male students wrote, sex is a commodity which, like gold, increases a man's social status. I want to hook up with him for social status. Hooking up with students who are widely considered hot was a way to get some of their status to rub off on you. The whole point of hookups is to be able to point the person out to your friends and be like, yeah, that guy, that's right, the hot one over there, I got that. It's almost bragging rights. If you hook up with a guy with the higher social status, athletes on certain teams and members of high status fraternities tend to be considered hotter than other men on campus. He's on the baseball team, so it doesn't even matter who he is. She'll say, I hooked up with a frat guy, or I hooked up with a guy on the football team. Instead of just simply saying she hooked up with a guy, it makes a difference. It automatically sounds better. Those are the only ones that matter. So many hookups, confirmed one student, are dictated by how our peers view the potential partner. Using indicators like hotness, blondness, fraternity membership, and athletic prowess, students form a working consensus about who is hookup worthy, and that guides their decisions. So many hookups are dictated by how our peers view their potential partner. I am unable to separate my opinion from those of my friends. Let me be careful to distinguish that this idea that people seek sexual contact with others they find attractive. Although people say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, in hookup culture, the beauty is in the eye of the beholders, plural. A hive mind mentality. A body's value is determined by collective agreement. It's crowdsourced. And it's not really collective agreement, it's market. I don't like the word collective agreement. It's more of a market decision. It's a marketable decision. And you can see how all of these forms of privilege, race, class, all of these things come into that decision making, that neoliberal decision making, and it is called feminist empowerment and emancipation. These comments reveal that hookup is not entirely for sex. It's not for sex even. It has an instrumental function. of elevating one's social status. The hookup uses the partner for one's own sexual pleasure, and the other one uses it for social status. Both uses are devoid of any personal consideration about the partner, which recapitulates economic market relationships. And this is basically, this masturbatory sex is the way in which the Pandora's box of our present cyberpunk dystopia has been opened. An example of how hookup partners use each other for their own satisfaction is Kendra, who enjoyed her hookup. I had fun, she remembered, and it was a learning experience, and it made me feel good about myself because I felt attractive to someone. Guys bang regardless of whether they think you're attractive. Kendra's basks in the abstract feeling of being attractive to someone without having had any personal interaction during the crude sexual act. The concrete individuality of the boy who found her attractive and the reasons he found her attractive are irrelevant to Kendra's happiness about being recognized by someone, anyone. What's really crazy here is that if you are attracted to someone based on some personality or some actual loving thing, that is seen as a negative. Let me reiterate. Your attraction to someone, if it is based on something that is personal, something that is unique between you two, that is seen as a negative. And it goes against positive psychology. Isn't that insane? Isn't that completely insane? Again, all of this is backed by feminist psychology. Feminist psychology re-evokes all of this, which is how insane of a world we live in. This is called emancipation. This is called freedom. This is called progressive. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people who never even get a chance to go to university, students actively use their agencies and subjectivities to keep hookups impersonal, casual, alienated, hedonistic. They minimize their interaction with their partner to ensure that they do not take it as a sign of affection which can be deepened. Expressions of tenderness, like gentle kisses, eye contact, holding hands, cuddling, and caresses, are to be avoided. Cuddling is for people you love. If you hold hands during sex, you're making love. If you make eye contact, you're making love. Hooking up is not making love. It makes sense when you think about it. If a student accepts the idea that casual sex is meaningless, then essentially everything else, no matter how small, carries more meaning. That little touching definitely signifies something a little more than just fucking. Focus on this word meaning for a second. Because again, in our desert of nothingness, where nothing can give us full meaning, in that world, what happens is the only thing that can give us meaning is something that conforms to neoliberal subjectivity. So, in a way, if you're cuddling, if you're making eye contact, if you're holding hands, if you're doing tender kisses, if you're making love, you're going counter to the collective psychology of meaning making. This is how sophisticated neoliberal colonialism is today. Not only is this how sophisticated neoliberal colonialism is today, but because this whole thing is framed under the mantle of emancipation, the progressive left views this as a form of decolonization. Do you see why this is absolutely evil? After it's all over, students confirm that the hookup meant nothing. It meant nothing. No, it didn't mean anything. By giving... and you know the worst part is? I know it didn't mean nothing. Why? Because I'm the guy after. I'm the other guy. I'm the guy that has to pay for this emotional labor. I know it doesn't mean anything. I know it means something. I know that this idea of not meaning anything is all just a ruse. Today, it's not just the men that are toxic masculinity that cover up their emotions. The rule is to be less close after a hookup than before, at least for a time. And this goes with this culture of cutoff culture. If students were good friends, they should act like acquaintances. If they were acquaintances, they should act like strangers. If they were strangers, they shouldn't acknowledge each other's existence at all. Unless at the beginning you made it clear that you want to hook up, then the expectation is to just pretend it didn't happen. When asked if she would hook up with a guy a second time, "No way," she said. No feelings for him, so he was not a viable hookup ever again. Since Ruby and Levy had been close friends before their hookup, she temporarily demoted him to acquaintance. A few days later, Ruby filled me in. "I've seen and interacted with Levy a few times, definitely much less than I would have in a 3-day span. I've only spent about 10 minutes alone with him, in which we joked and made casual small talk, graciously avoiding the fact that we've had each other's genitals in our mouths." A week later, Ruby would happily report, "It's as if the hookup never happened, and I am perfectly good with that." The interesting thing is how everybody repeats the same idioms. Now, what's super interesting is Ruby carefully capped Levy's perception and emotions about the hookup so that she could maintain her former distant relation with him, so that she could maintain a relationship at all. Girls do not want attachments. They resent it with boys who think they do. I felt no attachment to him whatsoever. He came by her dorm drunk the next day anyway, sloppily blurting out that he thought she was too attached to him. She was completely insulted by this assumption that she was more desperate of the two. Girls don't want boys caring if they are hurt, because that is benevolent sexism. You see how feminism is implicated from the beginning to the end here. So the methodology here for analyzing this hookup sex is our general method consists in finding the structure of men's activity that is engendered by given concrete historical conditions, and starting from that structure to bring out the essential psychological features of the structure of their consciousness. Of course, this isomorphism is not mechanically stamped onto consciousness by social conditions. Individual subjectivity is actively involved in fashioning their psychology from macro-cultural factors. Individuals organize neoliberal cultural elements in a particular manner and draw them into their sexual and personal social relations. Agency internalizes and reproduces normative cultural factors in new variants in new psychological fields. Individual agency is the subjective animation of this cultural psychological process that ultimately derives from the political character of macro-cultural factors and psychological tools. Personal enactments of activity are moments of forming a cultural habitus. They are not moments of personal expression or agency. That's the irony of this whole thing. Hookup sex, like all psychological phenomena, is cultural-centric, not person-centric. Back to the quote. Shakespeare satirizes a society of would-be individualists completely enslaved to one another, completely enslaved to the cultural psychology. Wade's students confirm that wild, free, crude, oblivious, sensational sex is actually an act of social cognition, social conformity, and social reproduction. This is an important lesson of cultural psychology. Hookup students, female and male, appropriate specific neoliberal forms and behavior into their personal sexual encounters. These include estrangement, volatility, precarity, temporality, instrumentalism, egocentrism, commoditization, branding, material success of accumulating material products, the need for rapid, frequent, hedonic, sensational, superficial sex leads to quick satiation of this need and equally quick rearousal. Success is defined as social status that is derived from attractive products, not from personal attributes of individuals. Entrepreneurial ideology of success, independence, and strength and power. All of these neoliberal elements of hookup sex are prevalent in the social domains that individuals traverse: schools, media, medical care, consumerism. Movies, games, television are almost all exclusively dominated by superficial, sensational, physical, impersonal sex and violence, with hardly any character development or meaningful personal relationships. Can you see how Bell Hooks' idea of love is so implicated in all of these ideas? Her definitional idea of love is so implicated within all of these neoliberal ideals. Angela McRobbie surveys changes in British film, television, popular culture, and women's magazines, and demonstrates how so-called feminist content has disappeared from them in the last decades and has been replaced by other feminist contents, aggressive individualistic, by hedonist female phallicism in the field of sexuality, and by obsession with consumer culture. That's feminist too, Madame McRobbie. In fact, it's even more feminist. It's the feminism that won. It's the loudest feminism. It's the feminism that sleeps with neoliberalism. Why? Because feminism was born in the personal as being political, which allows for the political to invade the personal, and that means that neoliberal subjectivity wins and socially reproduces itself through feminist progressivism. Our student subjects totalize these and extend them into their sexuality. And here we can see figure 6.1, how this neoliberal sex phenomenon is reinstated through all of these forms of ideas in our society to recreate that neoliberal sex. Our discussion of hookup sex is an important formation of cultural, historical, and historical materialist character of psychology. For the psychology, sexual psychology is fashioned from macro-cultural factors, which are historical materialist phenomenon. It is the neoliberal cultural political base, features, objectives, and functions of hookup sex that constitutes its features and effects. It is important to emphasize how much effort hookup partners spend on contouring every detail of the relationship to conform to neoliberal norms. The partners are active agents of neoliberalism. For example, the girls who adopt entrepreneurial, individualistic ideal, emancipation, and strength reject traditional values of intimacy and consideration of others. They disdain boys who are concerned with their feelings after a hookup encounter. Man, that hurts. They disdain boys who are concerned with their feelings after a hookup encounter. How many times? Oh God. That line really hurts. They condemn this as benevolent sexism. They construe personal concern as oppression, and they accept personal alienation as emancipation. Look at these exclamation marks in here. Girls who think, perceive, feel, and imagine that altruistic, considerate boys are weak and irresponsible are simply adopting the cognitive, perceptual, emotional, ideological package of entrepreneurialism as their psychological tool. They've internalized this neoliberal colonialism. Hookup sex requires careful emotional management of oneself and of one's partner to ensure that social psychological distance is maintained, and that sexual intimacy is not misconstrued as personal psychological intimacy. The narratives reveal how girls cap the interaction after it has been consummated. This whole process parallels the management of workers who are terminated. Terse strategies are prepared and implemented by personal staff for summarily informing workers, outsourcing some brief counseling resources if they are necessary, and then calling guards to physically escort the workers off the premises before they can disturb the ongoing work or require more extensive expenditures for treatment. The terminated employees are dispensed with as rapidly and officiously and decisively and expeditiously and irreversibly and impersonally as possible. Girls admit they employ the same strategy to dispense with their disposable lovers after they have used them for satisfaction. It's as if it never happened, and I'm perfectly good with that, is the exact sentiment that the personal manager feels when a disgruntled, dismissed employee walks out of her office. This macro-cultural psychological explanation and description of neoliberal hookup sex can be detected in the sexual narratives. Non-cultural constructs about sex are neither necessary nor useful. Hookup sex is neither a personal nor biological response to neoliberal cultural factors. Hookup sex is not a pleasure, principle, or life force, libido, eros, that opposes the work principle. It is neoliberal pleasure that complements and sustains neoliberal work. Hookup sex is neoliberal pleasure that reinforces the neoliberal system. It's not an escape from the system. It is a deeper conformity to the system by integrating personal sex within the system's character. Pleasure is a cultural phenomenon as much as work is. It takes on a cultural form that is congruent with the system's form. Hookup sex demonstrates this lesson from macro-cultural psychology. Hookup sex activates neoliberal sensibilities in the sexual act, including its preparation and termination. It is a practice field for developing and solidifying and habituating neoliberal competencies. It makes people more adaptable to neoliberal activities required at work, in school, in shopping, in medical encounters. For these activities resonate with the social interactions at parties and in bed. Neoliberal sex makes it easy to transition from the bedroom to the workplace, for it is all one seamless system. We have seen that students want to be free to pivot from one another without contradictory encumbrances. They want sex to be congruent with and adaptable to study and work. Hookup sex fits the bill. Hookup sex thus makes lovers better employees or managers or students. It is socially functionable. It's socially reproduced. Sex functions the same way entertainment does. Neoliberal capitalism provides entertainment that provide pleasure in a neoliberal form and content. This infuses the specific behaviors of neoliberal society with pleasure. It does not contradict them with competing forms of pleasure, for this contrast would expose them as oppressive. Infusing neoliberal behaviors with pleasure makes them agreeable and obscures their oppression, obscures their profession, obscures the oppression by calling it emancipation. It is true that neoliberalism is a sexually transmitted disease, just as it is cognitively transmitted disease, an emotionally transmitted disease, a perceptually transmitted disease, an artistically transmitted disease, a pedagogically transmitted disease, a religiously transmitted disease, a news media transmitted disease, and a medically transmitted disease. Every domain that neoliberalism permeates becomes a domain for extending it and strengthening it, aka cancer. Psychological and cultural assessment are that individuals are agents of neoliberalism. Individuals are just as agents of neoliberalism as Milton Friedman was. Hookup participants are neoliberal revolutionaries who tear down the ramparts of traditional society, traditional sexuality, and replace them with new neoliberal forms of behavior. Each woman who engages in a hookup relation is depersonalizing, commodifying, estranging, branding, trivializing, and instrumentalizing her partner, just as any salesperson or manager does within market relationships. CEOs extract surplus labor and we call them shame. But when this is done in our interpersonal relationships, it's called empowerment. Indeed, sex is a more effective insidious transmission of neoliberal practices and values than commercial salesmanship, because it is distinguished by intimate personal pleasure. Each hookup participant is oppressed by capitalist culture, but is also an oppressor of her partners. Each is a victim and a victimizer. In both of these complementary roles, the individual is a cultural agent with cultural agency and cultural competencies. There is nothing personal or authentic about this. The behavior cannot be validated as authentic personhood, which expresses personal choice of behavior. Personhood, agency, femininity, physicality, and expressiveness are neoliberalized. They do not express admirable or creative countercultural impulses. Their activity reproduces, intensifies, and extends normative, oppressive, neoliberal society. They must all be criticized on these grounds. Social norms cannot be utilized as ideals of fulfilling behavior. On the contrary, they must be criticized when they are oppressive and mystifying, and they can't be criticized because of the power equals privilege feminist narrative. This is a prerequisite for developing a countercultural subjectivity that can engage in emancipatory activity. Current forms of subjectivity, physicality, intersubjectivity, and femininity are anathema to emancipatory activity because they reproduce neoliberal behaviors. So he's talking about indigenous in terms of indigenous within the neoliberal form. This proves that glorifying of indigenous psychology is oppressive. It uncritically adopts indigenous norms as culturally fulfilling and worthy of respect, morally good, psychologically healthy. Yet neoliberalism is an indigenous psychology developed within an indigenous culture of neoliberal capitalism by indigenous citizens of that culture. We have seen that this indigenous culture and psychology has done to people socially, politically, economically, and morally. Macro-cultural psychology provides the political critique of culture by exposing its political base. Now we get to another very important crux of why feminism here is a problem, because feminism calls anything that doesn't conform to this neoliberal subjectivity as a form of internalized sexism or male benevolent sexism. A non-macro-cultural psychological analysis of hookup sex frames it as an expression of male sexism. This analysis diverts hookup sex from a general neoliberal phenomenon to a circumscribed male phenomenon that is unrelated to neoliberalism. Sexist hookup sex is a symptom of the male drive for power and privilege over females, what the Duluth model reinforces. The solution then becomes denouncing and punishing men's drive for power and sexual conquest. How many men are in prison today because of this logic? All power equals privilege logic is carceral feminism. Culture with its roots in fraternity, hierarchy, toxic masculinity, exclusionism, misogyny, and white privilege. Hookup appears to be designed and policed for the central positioning of male pleasure to the detriment of women. Because maintaining emotional distance is one of the key stages of a hookup, the focus on male pleasure can lead to verbal abuse, coercion, and rape when a woman wants to set her own boundaries. Disturbingly, hookup culture also effectively allows sexual predators to hide in plain sight, since their criminal activity might be indistinguishable from some of the hookup culture's ugly but acceptable behaviors. On the scientific level, this social analysis falsifies Wade's data because it fails to acknowledge the neoliberal origins, characters, dynamics, and functions of hookup sex. Sexist origins, characteristics, and functions are not neoliberal origins, characteristics, and functions. Because feminists and feminism routinely has changed the concept of the patriarchy from the rule of the father to the idea of a rule of all men over all women, it fails to realize that it itself is enacting the law of the 1%, the culture of the 1% of men who go around and basically have their way and create a culture, and all of these feminists, all of these people recreate that rather than treating people as an end in themselves, using people as a means, not caring about their personality. they recreate the culture of the 1%, and you are not able to criticize it because then you're a misogynist. And you can see that this plays out in the preliminary materials for A Theory of a Young Girl, where there was so much reaction to that book that book, the reason why it was even written in such a way, in a non-programmatic way, was because it can't say the things that it wants to say straight up. The narratives of the hookup girls refute the above explanation and description of hookup sex as fundamentally sexist. The girls were not seduced or coerced into it unwillingly to serve male power and privilege. You see, the feminist critique of feminism fails, right? This person tries to say that this whole thing is a form of toxic masculinity and all that stuff, but this is women who are empowered to do this, and those women call themselves feminists too. Girls proudly and actively initiated the alienated, impersonal, superficial, sensationalist, crude sexual relations of hookup sex. They proclaimed themselves to be sexual vultures aiming to get some dick. They flaunt their bodies and engage in provocative, crude sexual advances to encourage boys to grind on them without even seeing who the boys are. Girls report enjoying hookup sex on a sexual level and also on a lifestyle level that comports with their educational and occupational situation and neoliberal culture as a whole. Girls have adopted hookup sex as their emancipatory ideal and symbol. So the feminist critiques of this don't work. They actively resist psychological social intimacy with their partners, and they resent it when boys worry about girls' feelings. Girls maintain emotional distance with boys, which refutes Kohler's false claim that the emotional distance serves only boys' pleasure and leads to abuse and rape when women want to set their own limits. No! Wade's data demonstrates that women not only set their own emotionally distant limits, they also feel decisive and strong and independent about them. Women are quite brutal in enforcing emotional distance when their partners intimate any sense of intimacy. Many women on campuses are drawn to the ideal of hookups that feel like they're failing to be liberated if they don't have them. They say things like, I really envy the women who can participate in hookup culture. I wish I was like them. This means that the pull of hookup sex is underestimated by statistics of participation. For many non-participants wish to do so while struggling to overcome their own values. Nor do boys use hookup to conquer girls and force them into unwanted sex. Boys do not need to force them because the girls want unfeeling, uncaring, meaningless, crude sex. Both genders use each other for their own pleasure and social status in the eyes of their friends. So now I'm going to read and give you a preview of the coming study of the history of social capital that we're going to be doing before we get into Catherine Liu's work on sex. This is important because we're making a distinction between the commodification of interpersonal relationships and the moralization of the commodification of interpersonal relationship, or how it came to be for us to see that this commodification of interpersonal relationships is not problematic or alienating. It's in fact morally good, progressive, and psychologically healthy. So this is written in March of 1961 by Theodore Schultz, the American Economic Review, shying away from investments in man. Economists have long known that people are an important part of the wealth of nations. Measured by what labor contributes to an output, the productive capacity of human beings is now vastly larger than all other forms of wealth taken together. What economists have not stressed is the simple truth that people invest in themselves and that disinvestments are very large. Although economists are seldom timid in entering on abstract analysis and are often proud of being impractical, they have not been bold in coming to grips with this form of investment, social capital. Whenever they even come close, they proceed as gingerly as possible if they were stepping into deep water. No doubt, there are reasons for being wary. deep-seated moral and philosophical issues are ever present. Free men are first and foremost the end to be served by economic endeavor. They are not property or marketable assets, and not least, it has been all too convenient in marginal productivity analysis to treat labor as if it were a unique bundle of innate abilities that are wholly free of capital. The mere thought of investment in human beings is offensive to some of us. Our values inhibit us from looking upon human beings as capital goods, except in slavery, and this we abhor. And this is from 1961, from a time when the patriarchy was powerful. But we can see the beginnings of the destruction of these patriarchal ideals. We are not unaffected by the long struggle to rid society of indentured service and to evolve political and legal institutions to keep free men from bondage. These are achievements that we highly prize. Hence, to treat human beings as wealth that can be augmented by investment runs counter to deeply held ideals. Values. It seems to reduce men once again to mere material components, to something akin to property. I feel like Winston Churchill here. Democracy is the word. And it's an old writing, so okay. And for man to look upon himself as a capital good, even if it did not impair his freedom, may seem to debase him. No less a person that John Stuart Mill at one time insisted that people of a country should not be looked upon as wealth because wealth existed only for the sake of the people. And guess what? John Stuart Mill is a feminist icon today, but John Stuart Mill is also a utilitarian that allowed for all this crap in the first place. And he's the one who moralized it. But surely Mill was wrong. There is nothing in the concept of human wealth contrary to his idea that it exists only for the advantage of people. By investing in themselves, people can enlarge their range of choice available to them. It is one way free men can enhance their welfare. Among the few who have looked upon human beings as capital, there are three distinguished names. The philosopher-economist Adam Smith boldly included all of the acquired and useful abilities of all the inhabitants of a country as a part of capital. Of course, Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments was totally trumped by his wealth of nations. So did H. von Thunen, who then went on to argue that the concept of capital applied to man did not degrade him or impair his freedom and dignity, but on the contrary, that the failure to apply the concept was especially pernicious in wars. For here, one will sacrifice in a battle for 100 human beings in the prime of their lives without a thought in order to save one gun. You see, the idea of sacrifice itself is being diminished. No, we need sacrifice, but biopolitics doesn't let us. The reason is that the purchase of a cannon causes an outlay of public funds, whereas human beings are to be had for nothing by means of mere conscription decree. Irving Fisher also clearly and cogently presented an all-inclusive concept of capital, yet the mainstream thought has held that it is neither appropriate nor practical to apply the concept of capital to human beings. This is the world of patriarchy that thought it was inappropriate. This is the patriarchy that was supposedly allied to capitalism. Marshall, whose great prestige goes far to explain that this view was accepted, held that while human beings are incontestably capital from an abstract and mathematical point of view, it would be out of touch with the marketplace to treat them as capital in practical analysis. Investment in human beings has accordingly seldom been incorporated into formal core of economics, even though many economists, including Marshall, have seen its relevance at one point or another in what they have written. The failure to treat human resources explicitly as a form of capital, as a produced means of production, as the product of investment, has fostered the attention of the classical notion of labor as a capacity to do manual work requiring little knowledge and skill. Okay, that's a straw man. So the point of that reading was just to show that at one point, these ideas, even by patriarchal capitalism, was seen as inappropriate. But today, of course, it's not the patriarchy that is enforcing a form of capitalism. Patriarchy required people to die and sacrifice for democracy. We live in a post-patriarchal world. The patriarchy is dead, but instead we get that kind of feminist criticism of hookup sex that we just talked about that obscures even more. There's so much obscuring that's going on, all because of the moralization of the commodification of interpersonal relationships and this power equals privilege logic that doesn't allow for critique from the outside. And now we get to the PMC has sex. So the PMC is the professional managerial class, as according to Catherine Liu. During the Summer of Love, vanguardist May 68ers thought they invented new and revolutionary ways of experiencing sexual pleasure. Every year there's another edition of the Kama Sutra, it seems. They did not. They thought they were the first sexual adventurers in the course of human history. They were not. Sex has always been a messy affair, but during the 18th century in Europe, especially but not exclusively in France, the most male libertines who took sexual freedom seriously were writing about scientific inquiry into the observable world, the death of God, the worthiness of non-European cultures, and desecrating the sacraments while they flouted Christian morality by living in different degrees of sin. They were part of the sexual revolution, and they were very conscious of its political consequences. In the 18th century, French libertine literature was filled with anthropomorphized clitorises, detailed accounts of foot fetishes, and deep discussions of the pleasures of anal penetration. The sexual revolutionary to whom we owe many of our progressive ideals about sex is Marquis de Sade, an aristocratic class trader and a hopeless sexual deviant. He was a supporter of the French Revolution who spent much of his life in miserable prison cells writing pornography. Adorno and Horkheimer noted that the modern European demystification of sexual behavior began with Sade's reasoning about human sexuality and its probing, restless search for pleasure. In a marketable pamphlet contained in his pornographic novel of ideals, Philosophy in the Boudoir, he writes, Frenchmen, try harder if you want to be Republicans. Marquis de Sade argued in 1970. Sade argued that the 1789 revolution may have overturned church and monarchy, but it should go farther if it wanted to free the people and seal its abolition of superstition and oppression. Sexual knowledge, that is, knowledge of how to obtain pleasure with one's body and the bodies of others, should be available to all without prejudice. Libertinage, the exercise of absolute sexual freedom on the part of avowed atheists, had been the exclusive purview of aristocrats under atheists, and had been such an exclusive purview of aristocrats under the Ancien regime. Sade wanted sexual freedom for all, and he wanted that if revolutionaries did not overturn the idols of sexual morality and demand sexual freedom for the people, the powers of church and king would lie in wait, ready to overturn the revolutionary achievements of Danton and Robespierre and the French masses who had finally overthrown both king and church. In short, Sade warned of counter-revolution if the sexual revolution did not take the logic of emancipation to its limit. In Philosophy and the Boudoir, a bright 15-year-old virgin named Eugénie is initiated into the mysteries of erotic pleasure with men and women by an experienced 26-year-old libertine, Madame de Saint-Age, who teaches her how to maximize her pleasure in sex. In the pamphlet within the novel, Sade argues that adultery, sodomy, prostitution, incest, and rape should all be decriminalized. He turned out to be partially prescient. In 2020, the United States, sex before and outside of marriage is no longer taboo. Outside of extreme religious sects, mothers and fathers do not weep about deflowered sons or sexually experienced daughters. Furthermore, homosexuality has been decriminalized in almost every industrialized democracy in the world, while gay marriage has been legalized in many of these countries as well. The normalization, or at least decriminalization, of prostitution is seen in liberal democracies as a boon for sex workers and a final step in liberal, sexually enlightened society. It is hard to deny that Sade was a political visionary in part. Not all of the taboos Sade listed as oppressive have been lifted by enlightened societies. The dark aspect of his sexual enlightenment, the systematic misuse and abuse of others for one's own pleasure, or sadism, for example, has not become socially acceptable in any situation. We just talked about how it has become. Sadism was for Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer at the end of World War II a philosophical system that justified the radical coldness of the Enlightenment as the rampant instrumentalization and exploitation of and abuse of others, workers, chattel, serfs, and slaves. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that 18th century sentimentality was the obverse of sadism. Both value systems were necessary for the expansion of capitalism. Do-goodism, good intentions, masking a world of conquering reduction of life to profit margins. The sexual revolutionaries of the 60s replicated in part the Sadean Enlightenment without acknowledging their Western predecessor. They preferred citing Eastern sexual arts in their innovations. The new left sexual revolutionaries believed that they had forged a new relationship to pleasure that they wanted to share with the world. And the key here is that they wanted to share their emancipation with the world, meaning that they wanted to neoliberally colonize everything else. Just as they rejected the paltry satisfactions and mass manufactured goods and TV dinners provided by affluent societies, they rejected old-fashioned ways of having intercourse. Vanilla, from the muddy fields of Woodstock to the fragrant groves of Ken Casey's compound, the counterculture of the New Left proudly experimented with allegedly novel forms of hedonism, most of the time turned into polygamy for one charismatic male and submission of a group of wan women to his will. Feminists, unhappy with the primal horde antics of New Left men, discovered that women had to take back their own bodies and, in so doing, their relationship to pleasure. When the Boston Women's Health Book Collective published Our Bodies, Ourselves, a female-oriented guide to women's health, they promoted the idea that the establishment had been keeping information about female anatomy and female experiences from women. They believed that a compilation of critical information shared in networks of women would lead finally to the full emancipation of female sexuality. If the Sadean heroine was liberated by orgasms, PMC feminists, all feminists, believed instead that it was information about achieving orgasms that was truly emancipatory. College-educated New Left women really thought they were at the vanguard of sex and social life. Our Bodies suggested that everything a woman did, learning to repair her car, taking a long hike, going kayaking, was a personal leisure activity that contained incredible political significance. The personal is political. How our bodies insisted that women need to understand their bodies because men denied them access to the magical, frightening, unruly thing. The authors overlooked the fact that most women in the world did not receive regular medical care at all. In a further twist on their so-called privilege, the authors of Our Bodies earnestly told women to explore the pleasures of physical labor, ignoring the fact that the majority of women in the world performed physical labor not out of choice but out of necessity. Throughout human history, women have broken their backs carrying water and farming, while nursing their babies, harvesting fields by hand, washing clothes in rivers, and so on. When women lived in homes without electricity or running water, they did the kinds of work necessary to survive in agricultural economies of the sort that college-educated urban and suburban women could not even imagine. My grandmother in the village, how she would take care of herself through subsistence farming it's so crazy. It's so crazy how my great-grandmother, the matriarchs in my family lived, except as exotic places to visit in their gap years. The Industrial Revolution only created more kinds of work for working class women, some of it physical, some of it based on fine motor skills, but all of it routinized and punishing in its rhythms and production. In reaction to the hyperbolic ambitions of the women's movement, conservative culture warriors in the 70s and 80s promoted a moral panic about the impending dissolution of marriage and the family. But as time passed, countercultural PMC men and women did not become sexual libertines. In fact, the majority of college-educated Americans abandoned promiscuity and non-traditional romantic arrangements as they became more successful in their professions. They were incentivized to settle down and stop cycling through partners as their income and assets increased. The protection of PMC socioeconomic status created opportunities for sacrifice and compromise that precarious working class people abhorred. In 2020, it is among the non-college educated people that we find growing rates of divorce and single parenthood. It is truly an ironic reversal in values, upending the logic of the culture wars when PMC families, whether straight or gay, embrace monogamy and family values with greater zeal than their working class counterparts. We have to make a distinction here. The people who are actually the most successful, the most privileged people, uphold family values. Families are a site for privilege now. Whereas in the past, the family was a powerful place for the left to mobilize and to find some form of solidarity. Today, it is only a privilege for the ruling classes. Today, the family is only a site of privilege. For PMC feminism, the revolution in sex was mostly a revolution in information and education. It was a revolution that could be made by reading a book or in consciousness-raising groups about reading that book. That's so funny. About reading that book. It was a revolution that made orgasm and pleasure objects of PMC moral and pedagogical refinement. Remember the G-spot? To be part of this revolution, you had to accept that the private experiences and lives of elite PMC people were the most important sites of meaningful political and cultural activity. In sex-positive PMC feminism, the best sex could be had in a social vacuum. It could take place in a comfortable bed with clean sheets between consenting partners, free of economic or social anxiety. It is such an optimal situation. A woman could finger her clitoris, labia, or perineum in a leisurely manner, all while communicating her needs and desires to a sensitive and reciprocal partner. Good sex became sufficed with logic of information and communication theory upon which ideals of consent are built. In stark contrast to sexually enlightened PMC people, working class men and women were represented in popular culture of the 70s as trapped in misogyny, homophobia, prejudice, and violence, out of touch with their feelings and unable to communicate their erotic needs. For new left creatives and liberals working in Hollywood in the 70s, working class people were living in the sexual dark ages. Working class men were hopelessly authoritarian, and working class women unwittingly submissive to the patriarchal power of a family wage earner. Whereas at the turn of the 19th century, the working class had been undeniably at the vanguard of political struggles against capitalists and their proxies, the PMC, after '68, asserted that it alone was the vanguard of all revolutionaries, including, and above all, the sexual revolution. Under the Obama administration, the state became intensely involved in the enlightened regulation of sex. From 2008, PMC triumphalism, under the well-spoken and well-read president, channeled the collective energy of liberals to focus on sex in one of the most important sites of class formation, university campuses, especially elite university campuses. Instrumentalized obsession with sexual violence and sexual excess is an important part of American Puritanism. Moral and virtuous superiority in the sexual enlightenment makes up an important part of the countercultural inheritance of the PMC. Rather than focusing on economic malfeasance, an ascendant PMC elite under Obama pursued sexual crimes. Bring back our girls. Not at work or in the workplace, but on college campuses, with a zeal that liberals reserve for any policy that diverts attention away from economic redistribution. In short, rather than break up the banks or reform the financial sectors after he took office, Obama wanted to use his electoral victory to eliminate sexual violence on college campuses. I think it's Michelle. In 2011, his Department of Education Officer for Civil Rights sent a Dear Colleague letter to more than 7,000 universities, warning them that if they did not take action to prevent and remedy sexual violence and assault on their campuses, they would risk losing their rights to all federal funding. Legal commentators today admit that college administrations reacted to the letter with overcompliance. Many Title IX offices rejected innocent until proven guilty principles that form the democratic rule of law and set up campuses, investigative panels, and bodies that became little more than kangaroo courts. At the same time, sensational stories of sexual violence and sexual abuse on college campuses emerged on the mainstream media, as if to confirm the necessity of the Obama administration's stringent new policies. In 2015, the height of the Obama-era sex panic, Kirby Dick's Hunting Ground, was released by the Weinstein Company. Dick's documentary presented college campuses as terrifying places for young women to live. Dick, with the help of Harvey Weinstein, pandered to his liberal audience's thirst for stories about sexual violence. In 2016, Amber Frost cited the National Crime Victimization Survey numbers showing that non-college going women were 1.2 more times likely to be sexually assaulted than their college going counterparts. That's the most sober of these sex panic statistics. The vicarious traumatization here is so crazy. Sexual violence on college campuses attracted liberal PMC elites to a new front in the cultural wars, far away from inequality, oppression, and workplace sexual harassment and discrimination. Fighting sexual violence on campus allowed the PMC to reinforce its belief that white-collar professionals and lawyers like Atticus Finch were the true heroes in low-risk struggles against anything but economic abuse. Rolling Stone, a magazine born in the crucible of the rock and roll drug-fueled libertine counterculture of San Francisco in '67, covered one of the most lurid campus sexual violence stories of the Obama era. The magazine was once a highly successful media outlet for rock and roll fueled generation of middle-class consumers with growing buying power. By 2014, it had become just another mainstream magazine competing for eyeballs on the internet. The economic crisis for 2008 hit the magazine particularly hard. Ad revenues for print magazines peaked in 2007 and declined steadily year after year with no respite from either digital sales or the supposed economic recovery engineered by Bush and Obama administrations. It is quite understandable that when contributing editor Sabrina Erdely uncovered the story of an alleged gang rape on the University of Virginia campus, John Wiener and Rolling Stone's editorial board rushed to publish her piece, Rape on Campus. The 9,000-word story detailed from the point of view of Jackie, the alleged victim, a horrifying gang rape that had taken place in the Phi Beta Kappa Psi fraternity house in 2012. The story got 2.7 million online views on Rolling Stone's site, more than any other non-celebrity feature that the magazine had published. When the Washington Post decided to launch an independent investigation into Jackie's story, it became apparent that Erdely had not corroborated any of the details that Jackie had given her. Among the many gaps in Jackie's story, the Washington Post reporters discovered that there was no record of a party to that frat house on that night Jackie allegedly was raped. In 2015, the magazine published a retraction of that story, along with a detailed forensic investigation into Erdely's journalistic failings performed by a team from the Columbia School of Journalism. Rolling Stone and Sabrina Erdely were then sued by the fraternity and by Nicole Eremo, Dean of Students at UVA, for defamation. The wider cultural and political consequences of such a flagrant case of professional failure are difficult to assess, but the right certainly knew how to inflame popular hatred and resentment of the so-called mainstream media and professional journalists, and it took full advantage of this flagrant failure in reporting. Far-right news article site The Daily Caller became obsessed with the case and gloated over Rolling Stone's and Elderly's disgrace and legal troubles. For the conservatives and the far-right incubators of incel anger, the UVA story confirmed their narrative. Liberal media were filled with sensation-seeking hypocrites looking to cash in on fake news stories demonizing young men. You see how just we're going down this difficult, this terrible path. Fueled by neoliberal culture. It's all fueled by neoliberal culture. 50 years after the Summer of Love, college-going women were armed with more information about sex education than any generation before them, but they seemed less capable of assuming sexual agency and more in need of protection than previous generations of women, who had to deal with sexual autonomy and male desire without the help of university Title IX officers. For Laura Kipnis, self-described left-wing feminist, rebel, and free thinker, and professor at Northwestern University, we were living through a new period of sexual paranoia. Kipnis's account of her own Title IX investigation and the case against her former Northwestern colleague Peter Ludlow make up the heart of her book on the topic, Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campuses. Kipnis presents a clear, even-headed account of the Kafkaesque Title IX investigation launched against her after she published a series of articles about Northwestern and Peter Ludlow's case in the Chronicle of Higher Education. The first half of Kipnis's book is about the accusations against the philosophy professor and Title IX investigations that Northwestern launched against both Ludlow and Kipnis herself. Kipnis concludes that section with the observation that even Ludlow was certainly guilty of inappropriate behavior with an undergraduate and a graduate student. The loss of his job as punishment was entirely incommensurate with his crime, which Kipnis describes as motivated by naive childishness rather than raw abuse and exploitation. In the second half of Unwanted Advances, Kipnis summarizes many of the stories of the Title IX that she heard after going public as the subject of a Title IX investigation herself. For her trouble, Kipnis became a target of campus feminists and activists. But Kipnis would not be silenced. She is a liberal, a high liberal, which is the very best kind of liberal there is. She believes in robust debate and vigorous public dissent in the university, and her presentation of the abuse of Title IX is a courageous act in the cancel culture demonization of anyone who dares to question the protocols and assumptions behind sexual harassment investigations on college campuses. For Kipnis, the worst thing about sexual paranoia is that it makes us dumb. Sex panics provide a formula for intellectual rigidity. She blames the witch hunt atmosphere on campuses for undermining the traditional ideals of the university as a refuge for undermining the traditional ideals of the university as a refuge for free thinkers who are now being buried by an avalanche of platitudes and fear. The ideal university that Kipnis cherishes is a fantasy built on the social ideal of an egalitarian society where students and professors are libertine, free thinkers, free of material want. While the ideal was operative between 45 and 72, intensifying inequality and the increasing cost of higher education have destroyed this mid-century American ideal of the university. In Kipnis' fantasy university, everyone lives in an affluent society. Therein lies the basis of her ideal of intellectual freedom. Kipnis came of age at the tail end of an unprecedented expansion of higher education of the United States, and she exudes the confidence and bravado of someone who has not known real professional or economic insecurity. She is remarkably cut off from the torture chamber buzz of anxiety that afflicts students today. She gives sexual paranoia too much credit for the intellectual torpor and contemporary university life. In my experience, professional and economic insecurity is the greatest thought inhibitor of them all. But as we have just analyzed, these two things are not inseparable. Neoliberal sexuality, the paranoia of a state-enforced form of sexuality, from Title IX to psychology, they're all interrelated. And these are the kinds of things that Catherine Liu fails to realize. She's overly pointing her fingers. She points her fingers at Spivak and all these thinkers as well. In conclusion, Kipnis represents a cogent analysis of an epidemic of college blackout drinking while presenting the moral panic of our times as related to the incomplete emancipation of female sexuality. She believes that the problems of campus sex can be solved with more education for men and women on the topic of sexual ambivalence, consent, and agency. What if overvaluation of information and education is actually part of the problem with coming of age under neoliberalism and austerity policies? What if competition for higher education and the higher entry into the PMC are actually what fuels the sex panics that makes us all more stupid? In a society that sees education as a private good, an asset to be used to compete in an increasingly precarious and uncertain world, most young people do not feel as if they can afford to be curious or pleasure-seeking while in college. You have to participate in the culture of neoliberal colonialism because of your economic precarity. The intellectual and erotic freedoms cherished by Kipnis are shaped by a kind of aristocratic libertine thought enabled by mid-century American principles of economic redistribution and equality that contemporary university administrations neither understand nor support. The Obama administration's zealous enforcement of Title IX is very different from the way in which Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner engineered the bailout of criminal financial institutions after the meltdown of 2008. Why didn't the Obama administration send a dear colleague letter to investment bankers and financial advisors warning them about helping their clients evade billions of dollars in taxes? Taxes used correctly could be reinvested in public universities and public education programs. What about a dear colleague letter addressing Big Pharma, warning it about federal regulations coming down the pipeline about opioid dumping in rural areas? What about a dear colleague letter to Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Chase, Bank of America, or any other institution that insured, sold, and packaged bad mortgages to detriments of borrowers and investors? What about dear colleague letters to fossil fuel companies? In the absence of such letters, we have to conclude that the PMC elites prefer fomenting moral panics to implementing even the most modest redistributed progress economic policies even after the global financial catastrophe. To close our discussion on sex panics, we have to turn to the story of Emma Sulkowicz. In 2015, Sulkowicz graduated from Columbia with a BA in visual arts, for which her mattress performance, carry that weight, fulfilled a degree requirement. She did? I didn't know that. I can't believe that. Sulkowicz's piece was staged as a protest and performance against the fact that she got an A for that. The piece was staged as a protest and performance against the fact that 2013 accusations against Paul Nungesser had not led to any consequences for him, that he was allowed to continue being a student at Columbia. Sulkowicz had wanted him expelled for the alleged attack, but after an internal inquiry, Columbia University found Nungesser without responsibility for the alleged assault. Sulkowicz was furious about the findings and spent her senior year on campus carrying the mattress upon which the alleged violation took place. Her sense of entitlement, her confident disregard for due process, her indifference to privacy became realized in her performance as art. An indifference to privacy that all feminists today share. An indifference to privacy that has opened the Pandora's box to Black Mirror totalitarianism. Like all endurance-based performance art, the senseless expenditure of physical effort is a display of the elite's absolute freedom from the necessity of physical labor. From this point of view, Sulkowicz's performance of mattress carrying makes a mockery of the physicality of manual labor. Most workers in the world still labor with their bodies and have to endure physical pain and hardship during the workdays. To choose physical endurance is the ultimate sign of PMC sovereignty. It should go without saying that Sulkowicz first and foremost objectified her own trauma. The performance allowed her a degree of disassociation, but it also gave her the platform upon which to make a bid for visibility, notoriety, fame, and celebrity. It's funny to talk about platforming here because Catherine Liu has been deplatformed in a way for even being able to talk about this. Having the courage to talk about this costs her much social capital, although she is a tenured professor. She became a one-woman placard, publicizing a traumatic experience to make public something that she had to endure in private. The personal is political is neoliberalism. Sulkowicz, as an artist and a child of PMC elites, her parents being psychologists, was responding to, commenting on, reproducing the regime of post-industrial work, a kind of work that entails the constant production of publicity, gathering activity in the name of self-branding. In the pursuit of justice, Sulkowicz became famous for her ability to turn private pain into public spectacle. Sulkowicz claimed that she had become open to their point of view. She also claimed to be tired of contemporary art and said that she was quitting being an artist. In the meantime, her alleged attacker, Nungesser, and Columbia University settled out of court for a lawsuit in which Nungesser successfully sued the university for gender discrimination based on Title IX. For liberals, sexual violence on campus is of critical importance because 1. Universities are sites of class reproduction, and all intersubjective encounters in such places must be rationalized. 2. The PMC elite loves to play virtuous hero in clear-cut moral dilemmas where economic exploitation is not an issue. Laura Kipnis should not have been surprised by the fact that a segment of PMC young people no longer see sex as an activity where pleasure and agency are critical. It's a social capital game. For Sulkowicz, everything that happens to her can be instrumentalized and turned into fodder for publicity and prosecution. The lack of boundaries between the personal and the political is the poisoned fruit of contemporary neoliberalism's metabolization of the historical counterculture. Yes, that's it. It's the Adam and Eve fruit. The personal is political. If the case of Harvey Weinstein lies outside of the purview of my critique of sex panics, it is because Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey focused on workplace sexual assault corroborated by countless victims and employees of the former movie mogul. It would be wonderful if we could extend the investigative attention and care paid to Harvey Weinstein's victims to other workers who have been exploited and abused in far less glamorous workplaces. I mean, that's a very important point. Weinstein's victims were terrified of him because of the power he wielded over their careers and professional prospects. It is clear that sexual coercion and economic insecurity work together to create conditions for abuse. There is no sexual freedom or pleasure without freedom from terrifying economic fear for simple survival to which many of us are reduced. Weinstein's Sadian treatment of women would not have been possible without the professional and economic power that he wielded over an entire industry. But you can see how that economic power was very, very much sidestepped by Me Too, or turned into a game of how we can empower ourselves within the market enclosures rather than changing the market itself. It's like that picture of inequality where a bunch of people are looking over the fence. The ideal would be to give people more boxes, but actually the true revolutionary aspect of all that would be to take away the fence itself.
What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.